By morning it was snowing a lot and it was noticeably colder. We moved towards the forest, leaving 2 ribbon-shaped tracks behind us. The sounds of the waking village came from the valley below. Roosters crowed and dogs barked lazily. The valley lived its usual life, and before us grew a gloomy wall of forest, the far edge of which was lost in the pre-dawn gloom. We entered the forest and stopped. "Yes, I seem to be losing my fitness," said Starzig, wiping the sweat from his face. "Up to the border, we'll be walking upwards all the time. Look, a crow is flying." "What a pity we're not crows," Starzig sighed and nodding at the houses left in the snowy valley. "And what a peaceful picture." I couldn't speak. My throat was suddenly constricted. I finally realized with complete clarity that I was leaving my homeland voluntarily, and that I might never come back here again, never see my family and friends. Since I could die under a foreign sky, my feelings at that moment could not be described with mere words. My emotions were too strong to be shared even with my closest friends, if they were near me now. I was silent. I don't think Staszek expected me to answer. Powerful tree crowns shaded the ground from the snow, so we took off our skis and moved deeper into the forest. For several miles we walked with skis on our shoulders on a soft carpet of pine needles, only lightly dusted with snow, occasionally checking our path with a compass. At about noon we came out of the forest and had a short break, having a snack of bread and cheese and sausage. Then we got on skis and skidded across a field along the River Seine, but at a fairly safe distance from villages and detached houses. What kept us busy were the tracks we left in the snow. Luckily for us, the wind picked up in the afternoon, bringing snow clouds. It began to snow. At first, rare snowflakes fell from the sky, but soon the snow fell thickly. Snowdrifts grew under the trees. Visibility deteriorated sharply. Now we were not afraid of being seen, but we had difficulties in travelling. We could not afford to stop all the time and check the route on the map. In order not to go round in circles, I directed the movement, holding the compass in my hand. The blizzard did not subside, and we moved forward extremely slowly. Sometimes we had to go round a ravine that was too deep, and this also took a long time. I often stumbled and fell as I kept my eyes on the compass. At one point I pulled too hard on the lanyard on which the compass was hanging, and it fell through the deep snow. We spent over an hour looking for it missing. In the end we had to accept the loss. It was beginning to get dark, and we decided that we must have walked about half the distance to the border. There was no point in going back to the village for a new compass. Oh, and we wouldn't find our way back in the dark. For the same reason, there was no point in going forward, especially as we were terribly tired.
"Instiche, we can't spend the night in the snow," shouted Stasek, trying to shout over the noise of the wind. "We'll just freeze and die. Let's try to find a village."
Oh, to be captured by the Ukrainians. I shouted back, "I prefer to go forward."
"We should try not to get caught by them. We'll find a barn, bury ourselves in hay and get warm. We can't survive this night in the snow." I had to agree, and who could refuse the prospect of spending the night in a cosy nest of hay instead of shivering, dying of cold, in a snowdrift? Stasek heard a dog barking through the howling wind. I honestly didn't hear anything.
"It's over there," said Stasek. "Let's go." Half an hour later, the farm appeared ahead. We didn't see the dog, but he had smelled the intruders and started barking frantically. "Let's go round it from the leeward side," I said into his ear, tugging at Staszek's sleeve to attract his attention. We quickly took off our skis and, keeping in sight the vague outlines of the house and barn, climbed over the fence, walked through the small garden, and came out to leeward. The dog calmed down, and we were able to approach the barn. It was wooden, with a thatched roof. There was a huge snowdrift next to the shed where we stuck our skis and poles. The shed was unlocked. There was grain in one corner and clover and hay in the other. We made a hollow in the hay, enough for 2 of us with our rucksacks, and camouflaged the entrance. In total darkness we greedily finished the rest of the food.
"It's a pity we have nothing to drink," said Stasek.
So am I. I wish I had a jug of warm milk."
"I'm sure they have milk in the house," sighed Stas. "And you think the Ukrainians would offer us milk?"
"How did you determine that Ukrainians live in the house by the barking of the dog?" "I would prefer not to find out who really lives here," I answered. I'm sure the girls were not mistaken when they told us that Ukrainians live in all these villages. Not a single sound came from the house, so it was impossible to determine the nationality of the people living there. We were warm in our shelter. We ate, and the wind seemed to be subsiding. Tomorrow, then, it would be easier to walk. We must get out before daylight, I warned Stasik, so wake me if you wake up first. I will. I know how to wake up at the right time. Let me wake you up at 5 o'clock. That's great. 5 o'clock it is. Once we were warm, we fell asleep almost instantly. I was sound asleep and had had a good night's sleep, but it was the awakening that spoilt the whole impression of a good night. I heard voices coming from outside, and as I pulled the hay apart, I realized it was clear day outside. We had overslept.
Stasik was awake too and strained to hear the voices. 2 men were talking, and soon a woman joined them. The snowstorm had covered our tracks, but they found our skis in a snowdrift by the barn. The conversation was in Ukrainian.
They must be inside, said one of the men. Run to Mikhailo and tell him to bring the Sicheviksi Latmetim, and we will keep watch here so that they do not escape.
The first violin in the creation of Transcarpathian Ukrainian armed forces was played by the Provod of Ukrainian nationalists, which was part of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the Secheviks established garrisons in a number of strategically important points.
We knew that the Secheviks were Ukrainians who had received weapons from the Germans to hunt down Poles fleeing abroad. Soon they would be here, they would pull us out of the trap we had put ourselves in, beat us up and hand us over to the Germans. Shall we risk it? Stasik whispered hotly in my ear.
I'm in favour, but we have to take them by surprise. We'll creep quietly to the door, and then we'll jump out and run towards the forest.
I'm ready, Stasik whispered. Let's go together.
We crawled out of the hay. Stasik picked up a pitchfork from the floor of the barn, and I took my dagger in my hand and pushed open the door. 2 men in boots and sheepskin hats stood near the door. One held a pitchfork and the other an axe. They stood still for a moment in surprise. Don't move, I ordered. Let us go.
Then they woke up. They rushed at us. A man was coming at me with an axe over his head. I backed away slowly, but when I hit a snowdrift, I flew forward and hit the man in the stomach with my head. Dropping the axe, he grabbed my arm, so he fell into the snow, and I managed to strike him twice with the dagger. He let go of me and grasped his stomach with a groan.
When I looked round, I saw Stasek. One of his arms was injured, and blood was oozing from it. He was stabbing the man lying on the ground with a pitchfork with wild anger.
Enough, run, I shouted.
He struck the last blow, dropped the pitchfork and ran after me. We climbed over the fence and ran up towards the forest.
We ran through the deep snow, falling and rising again. Suddenly a shot rang out. We fell down into the snow like underfoot. When we turned round, we saw several men running after us. 2 of them had rifles.
We jumped to our feet and began to climb the slope with renewed vigour. Every time a bullet whistled past me, I experienced the same feelings I had already experienced in Vinnyky. When after escaping from the pigsty I was shot at by Soviet soldiers, I was fleeing again, and in those brief moments I had time to imagine how I would be hit by a shot in the back, fall face down in the snow, and lie there until the life drained out of me 1 drop at a time. I gasped. Bloody circles swam before my eyes. My throat was dry. Sweat was pouring down my face, but my legs carried me higher and higher up the slope, at the top of which I could see the edge of the forest. The bullets drove us on, forcing us to move faster. We reached the top of the slope and rushed towards the forest. There was little snow in the forest. Gasping and mumbling incoherently, we waded deeper and deeper. Suddenly I felt that I could not stand this race any longer. My heart was jumping out of my chest. My legs were trembling. I collapsed to the ground.
When I came to my senses, I saw Stasik lying beside me. For a few minutes we lay there, unable not only to talk, but even to listen to see if we were being chased. Then we forced ourselves to get up and, still panting, walked. We could no longer run into the forest. Every few minutes we stopped and listened, but the silence was broken only by bird voices. However, we were well aware that rumours about us would quickly spread through the villages and we had to get out of the area. Luckily, the sun came out and we were able to orientate ourselves on the terrain. There was little snow in the forest, as I said, but we were still moving extremely slowly, especially in the dense undergrowth. After about 2 hours, we stopped. "We don't want to eat now," I said to Stashik, "but what will we do when we get very hungry?"
I heard no answer. Stashek sat on a fallen pine tree and looked his injured arm.
"No, so it hurt a lot?" Stashik shook his head in silence, and only when we got up to go on.
Why didn't they let us leave? Why? They would have stayed alive then.
"Maybe they are alive." "No, I killed him." "I know you did." "No, come on, Stashik. We had no choice. It was either them or us." "Yeah, I know. But I've never killed anyone like that," he mumbled. "I just couldn't control myself, like I'd lost my mind." A few hours later we came to the edge of the forest and, stopping behind the trees, took out the map. After a long study of it, we had to admit that we had no idea where we were at the moment. To our left we could see a river valley, which might well have been the San Valley. On the right, about 1.5 kilometers away, we could see a pine forest, and directly in front of us was a field, followed by a thicket of bushes, which on the slope became a forest. To the south the terrain gradually rose and was forested with a few snowy patches of fields. We had no choice but to head south, climbing higher and higher. "How far do you think we are from the border?" Stashik asked. "As according to the map, the border runs along the ridge. It is quite possible that it is that ridge."
Then we have to be very careful not to run into patrols.
We walked round to the ridge, avoiding open spaces. It seemed close, but after several hours of travelling it was still high above us, standing out invitingly against the bright blue sky. The slope was no longer impenetrable, but the snow was deeper and there were rocks underneath. It became more and more difficult to walk, and we began to stumble more often, slipping off the rocks and falling into the snow. At times it seemed as if we were almost motionless. We were exhausted and hungry. On the left below us, we could see smoke rising above the roofs of the houses. There was bread and milk, and plenty of all sorts of food, but not for us. We had last eaten last night and realized that we were unlikely to get anything to eat before we crossed the Hungarian border. We had climbed about 900 meters, and it was still a long way to the ridge. Hunger was what prevented us from moving faster. Not the deep snow, not the slippery rocks, not the steep ascent, but hunger, excruciating hunger, slowed us down. Suddenly, as it often happens in the mountains, clouds came and a blizzard played out. It got dark. A strong wind blew. The bad weather caught us on a rocky section. We were in total darkness, and we were afraid to move from the place not to fall down. We had only a short distance to go to the border, a little over 1.5 kilometers, and we were stuck on a bare patch, hungry and frozen. The snow was falling and falling, levelling the rocky slope. Huddled tightly together, we crawled into a crevice between the rocks. The snow was clogging our eyes and ears, climbing over our collars. In half an hour we were already shivering from the cold. Our teeth made sounds like machine gun cues. Our bodies were becoming unruly and insensible. In order to warm ourselves somehow, we tried to struggle, waving our arms sluggishly, but the wind and snow nullified all our pathetic attempts in no time. The winters in Poland are harsh, and I have been taught since childhood that one should never fall asleep in such a situation. In sleep, a person doesn't feel the cold and dies. I wanted to sleep badly, but I wanted to live even more. I had to live. I wanted to live. I pulled Stashik's sleeve. No reaction. I started to rub him, but he didn't move. In the darkness I felt his face, over which he had pulled his ski cap.
Stashik. I shouted, hitting him in the chest with my fist.
He mumbled something faintly, but the wind drowned out his words. I kept hitting him as hard as I could until he responded.
Get off me, he said angrily. Get off me, or I'll break your nose.
You want to die, don't you? I yelled at him. I don't want to die. I want to live.
Leave me alone. I'm tired. I want to rest, Stashik whimpered.
You'll die if you sleep. You can't sleep. Do you hear me? Wake up now. He didn't even bother to answer, so I punched him in what I thought was his face. He swore and hit me in the head. In response, I screamed and threw several punches at him. I woke him up, but there was still a long night ahead. The storm was still raging, and we needed to find some shelter immediately.
There were a few fir trees on the slope.
I'll break some branches, I shouted to Stashik. We'll build a hut. While I walk, you shout so that I can find you later. I managed to cut a few branches with my dagger, and getting on all fours, I dragged them to where Stashik was sitting. We put some of the branches between the stones and made a sort of shelter out of the rest, crawled inside and covered the entrance with them. Our work was completed by the storm, which pelted the shelter with snow and cut us off completely from the world.
The hard work restored our circulation. We warmed up a little and protected ourselves from the wind. But now the hunger made itself felt. The last time we had eaten had been over 24 hours ago, and we had not had a hot meal for over 2 days.
Outside, the storm was raging, and the layer of snow that covered our shelter grew thicker and thicker. We could no longer hear the howling of the wind. We sat huddled together in total darkness. Sometimes, if one of us carelessly touched the roof, fine snow would fall from above.
We wanted to sleep, not because we were cold. No, we were quite warm. We just needed a proper sleep. But we were afraid of falling asleep and not waking up, so we decided to take turns sleeping. One was to sleep and the other was to stay awake and, in order not to fall asleep, talk loudly to himself.
I woke up to Stashik screaming. What happened?
He mumbled something inaudible, and I realized that we had both fallen asleep and he was having nightmares. How long had we slept?
I was cold, and Stashik was shivering too. I shook him awake and suggested we look outside, hoping it was morning. We shoveled the snow and daylight burst in. Looking at the clock, I saw that it was 8 in the morning. The snow had stopped. The wind had died down, but the mountain tops were hidden under low-hanging grey clouds. The snow had almost doubled in thickness overnight.
I'm hungry as a wolf, I complained to Stashik, rubbing my hands to get the blood flowing again.
I'm terribly hungry too. I'm so weak I can hardly move my legs, Stashik admitted.
Blood was smeared on his face. I must have broken his nose last night when I forced him to wake up. I apologized.
No. Take your time. We'll talk about it, he promised. When I've eaten something, well, let's get moving. They'll give us something to eat when we get to Hungary. Are you sure that the border runs along this ridge? Stashik asked. I took out a map and we scrutinized it. The border did indeed run along a ridge, or rather one of several ridges. We found on the map the village where we had been so inhospitably welcomed and concluded that we had correctly determined the direction of travel. When we get to the top, we'll have to be very careful, Stashik warned. There are frequent patrols there. We'll crawl and at the right moment we'll dash across the border. What makes you think that we'll have a chance to get that good moment? Stashik asked. I'm sure of it. There are border posts on every border. Otherwise, how would the patrols know how the border runs? We'll wait for the next patrol to pass and then we'll sneak across the border. Have you ever been to the border? Not only have I been to the border, but I've crossed it. We went up again. We walked even slower than before because now we had to hide behind trees. And besides, there was so much snow that we were falling down to our chests. After 3 hours walking, we realized that we had conquered the ascent. The plain stretched out before us. It looks like we've made it, I said to Stashik when we decided to take a break. We piled ourselves in the snow so as not to stand out against the white background. We covered about 200 meters by running from tree to tree and then slowly crawling on all fours. Finally, about 100 meters away, the striped boundary post showed itself. For about half an hour we lay in the snow, listening sensitively and looking round the neighborhood. No one appeared. We crawled closer and listened again. No patrols. No one at all. Beyond the pillar, the terrain changed abruptly, going downhill. Just like on the map, I whispered. There were a few trees between us and the pillar. The border ran along the ridge, strictly outlining its contour. The pristine snow shone white. No one had left any footprints on it after the storm. Shall we risk it? Stashik asked, burning with impatience. Let's risk it. Let's go. We crawled, leaving 2 deep furrows behind us. But we didn't care about that now. We were on neutral territory. Once on the other side, among the trees, we jumped to our feet and began to descend the mountain, slipping and falling in the snow. We laughed carefree and joked with each other. The tension of the last 24 hours had let go. You know, Stashik, I was afraid we'd be shot at the border. I thought they had dogs, barbed wire, and frequent patrols. To be honest, I was afraid of that too, Stazik admitted. I never thought it would be so easy. Well, Stazik, we did it. We have crossed the border. From the mountain ridge we descended into the pine forest. We really hoped to reach a village or a Hungarian border post where we could warm up and eat. Apparently, we crossed the border a little east or west of where we were supposed to be, suggested Stazik as we unfolded the map and tried to establish our position. Let's head south. The map shows several Hungarian villages in that direction. Again, we had to climb a slope densely forested, and although we did not have to hide now, we were very tired and hungry. In addition, the sky was covered with clouds, and we could no longer orientate ourselves by the sun. Step by step, we slowly climbed upwards, and after walking a few hundred meters, we sat down to rest. Again we walked, and again we sat down. We had just sat down to rest when we heard a noise that made us shudder. A herd of reindeer rushed past and disappeared into the forest. A few seconds later, several grey shadows flashed 50 meters away from us and disappeared in the same direction. The wind was blowing in our direction, and they did not smell us. The whole action lasted no more than 3 seconds. It looks like there's a village around here, Stazik said. Where else could the dogs have come from but the village? It wasn't dogs, Stazik. It was wolves. Wolves. Yes, wolves. There are many wolves in the Carpathians. Wow. I've never seen wolves before. Maybe thankful they haven't seen us. Stazik must have sensed the relief with which I said these words, because he immediately asked, would they have attacked us? Of course they would. Why did they chase the deer? For the pleasure of running through the woods? We moved on and soon came across deer and wolf tracks. And then, finally, the pass. We sat down to rest, and suddenly Stashek, turning his head from one side to the other, confidently said, I hear dogs barking. I don't hear any barking. You're imagining it. He listened and declared that he definitely heard dog barking. It's coming from over there, and pointed down into the valley, which was hidden from us by the trees. With difficulty we got to our feet, and in full confidence that the Hungarians would give us something to eat, we scrambled down the valley. The forest was left behind us, and a field opened before us, at the other end of which stood several houses sunk in the snow, with smoke curling over their roofs. We could hardly drag ourselves across the snow-covered field, leaving 2 deep furrows behind us. What language will we speak to them in? Stazik asked when we reached the nearest house. Sign language or Polish. They will understand that we are cold and hungry. When the dog saw us, he jumped on his chain and barked fiercely. Someone's face flashed through the window. We went around the dog, approached the house, opened the door, went into the hay where there were hoes, pitchforks, and other implements of peasant labour, and knocked at the door leading to the room. We heard some inarticulate sounds. We pushed open the door and entered the warm room, which at first seemed dark after the white snow. When we looked more closely, we found a man, a boy and 2 women in the room. In turn, Stazik and I stared at them. We did not know how to start a conversation. Stazik was the first to venture. We are Poles. We are hungry, he said slowly and loudly, and added, we have crossed the The man laughed but said nothing. He scrutinized us from head to toe, noting our tired faces, our trembling legs, the hungry gleam in our eyes. We came from Poland, across the border. I joined the conversation. To our surprise, the man answered in Polish. You haven't crossed the border, he said, and laughed again. There is still a long way to go to the border. While the man was talking, I noticed that one of the women whispered something to the boy. He nodded and ran out the back door. From the window we saw him run somewhere. How much further is it to the border? Stazik asked. The man didn't bother to answer. Instead, he said something to the women. In Ukrainian, one of them immediately ran out. The man laughed again. You will never cross the border. Panui Policy 12, he said with a vicious grin. You are in a Ukrainian village. Everything became clear to us. We glanced at the windows, but they were too small. The door behind us was locked. We were trapped. In a few minutes the boy would bring the Secheviks, and all our efforts would be in vain. They would beat us and hand us over to the Germans. Stazik and I looked at each other, and I saw the same fear in his eyes that he had probably seen in mine. My legs buckled, and I leaned on the bed and slowly settled down on the bench. Stazik sat down next to me. Did you suffer a lot during the war, Panawi Policy? The man asked, smiling mockingly. And it will be even worse when the Secheviks come here. You sons of bitches, that's what you are. With these words, he jumped up from his seat, ran towards us and swung for a blow. Stasik jumped first. With a wild scream, he tried to grab the man's throat, but the Ukrainian was quick. He dodged Stashek and was about to get something from under the bed. When he leaned over, I punched him in the stomach. There was no time to think. Stashek and I raced past the screaming women, opened the back door. Where are we going, Stefan? Stasek shouted on the run. I don't know. A little girl was coming towards us from a neighbouring house. When she saw us, she froze on the spot, either from fright or from curiosity, or maybe from both. Where is the border, little girl? I asked the child. There, on the hill, she answered, pointing to a hill less than a kilometre away from the village. Stashek and I had come to the village from the opposite side. Without saying a word, we rushed in the direction indicated. We ran the shortest way between the houses, and several times we had to jump over fences. Women jumped out of the houses, shouting and cursing after us. A man threw a stick at us, but missed. Another man threw an axe, but it fell into the snow. We ran up the hill. There were hardly any trees on the steep slope. Drowning knee-deep in snow, we lifted our foot as if in slow motion, shook off the snow, and lowered it 2 feet forward. We would pull the other foot out of the snow and repeat the same procedure. At times we fell into the snow up to our waists. The slope got steeper and steeper, and we climbed on all fours for a while. We were puffing and panting, making gurgling noises with our throats. There were shouts behind us. It meant that people were running after us. Shots rang out, and we saw fountains of snow raised by the bullets. We could not run fast and hide from our pursuers, but neither could we turn back. We scrambled forwards. Danger was coming at us, and we could hardly move our arms and legs, as if we were stuck to one place on the slope. The valley was filled with the sound of gunfire. The higher we climbed, the less snow there was. Gasping from the terrible strain, we reached the top on all fours and saw a path trampled in the snow and a striped red and white. With difficulty we covered the distance to the pole, went down the hill, ran into the woods and fell to the ground. When I came to my senses, Stasik was on all fours, and the snow in front of him was coloured red. Everything was blurred before my eyes, and I was able to speak only after a few minutes. Are you hurt, Stasik? He shook his head and pointed to my nose and chest. I noticed that my nose was bleeding too, and my mouth tasted of blood. My throat was dry and my chest hurt. I scooped up snow with the palm of my hand and put it in my mouth to extinguish the fire burning in my chest. I fainted again. When I woke up, I saw my boots in front of my face. Neither Stashek nor I had such shoes. I looked up. In front of me stood a man in an unfamiliar uniform. He was smiling. I tried to smile back, but it didn't work. Then I saw another man in uniform helping Stas up. Are you Hungarians? I asked when I realized I had regained the ability to speak. One of them nodded and said something, but I didn't understand him. He lifted me up and, seeing the blood on my face and on the snow, wrapped his arms around me tighter. I pointed to my mouth and coughed. He understood what I wanted to say and gave me a drink from the flask. I immediately threw up. With the help of Hungarian border guards, we reached the border post located in a small village. The commander's wife, who spoke broken Polish, fed us hot soup and bread with sausage. I greedily swallowed the hot soup, not noticing that it burned my mouth. God, it had been a long time since I had eaten hot food. The commander was still familiarizing himself with our documents, and we had already eaten everything his wife had prepared for us. After lunch, we were taken to the barracks, fell on our beds and slept, without dreams or nightmares, for 16 hours straight. It was 3 December 1939 on the calendar. Chapter 12. While we slept, 4 more Poles crossed the border in the same place as us. On the 5th of December, the 6 of us were taken by lorry to Unvar 13, where there was a collection point for Poles who had crossed the border illegally. We were chilled to the bone as we travelled along the bumpy road in an open lorry to Ungwar. It was 20 degrees Celsius outside, and it was quite cold in the barracks, where about 100 Poles, brought from different border posts, were gathered. We were fed with hot soup, and the interrogations began. We waited impatiently to be summoned. There was only one interpreter working, and the procedure was slow. Finally, it was Stasik's and my turn. I introduced myself and told him frankly that we had taken part in combat operations during the war in Poland. Later I realized that I had made a serious mistake. Hungary was obliged by international agreement to intern such people. Civilians were housed in private homes and unguarded camps, while ex-servicemen were kept under guard in camps behind barbed wire. This was an unexpected blow to us. We had fled Poland not to spend years behind barbed wire in idleness and boredom, but to get to France as soon as possible and take part in the war. We tried to make reasonable arguments, but unfortunately our ignorance of the Hungarian language made us dependent on the interpreter, and he was too tired to get into everyone's problems. "You will explain all this to the authorities in Budapest," was his reply. "Tomorrow you will be taken there." We spent the night in a cold barracks. There were not enough beds for everyone, and we slept on the floor. Breakfast, again hot soup and bread, was brought almost in the middle of the day, and we, dissatisfied with the delay and domestic inconvenience, grumbled about the poor organization. There were quarrels between us about anything, even the most insignificant things, about the place at the only stove, who and how much warm water to take for washing. Someone started collecting signatures for a petition. Many years later, remembering the time when I was a refugee in a foreign country, I clearly realized what ungrateful people we were. We demanded better living conditions, food and medical care. We were annoyed by the lack of understanding, the most insignificant delays. Everyday inconveniences caused an explosion of indignation on our part. Escape from our country was usually associated with incredible difficulties and hardships. But we cherished the hope that once we crossed the border, we would find ourselves in paradise, where we were eagerly awaited. Subconsciously, we even expected some kind of reward for our courage. We expected praise, but we were greeted by tired officials who had dealt with hundreds of others like us. We had hoped for sympathy and understanding, but here the simplest question turned into an insoluble problem. We even began to feel some unspoken resentment towards our unwilling hosts for not wanting to appreciate our torment and honor our bravery. The Hungarian authorities in Ungar divided us into two groups. One included civilians and the other those who had taken part in the hostilities. The second group was taken by train to Budapest under guard, while those who were in the first group were taken by lorry unguarded to the nearest village and accommodated in private houses. We noticed that the first group included people who had previously introduced themselves to us as career officers. "What the hell are they doing among civilians?" I asked Stasik. "What we all should have done," someone replied. "They'll be in France much faster than we will." I have to admit that we, unlike them, just didn't have the smarts. "I would never have thought of that," I agreed. "Now you'll have plenty of time to think." In an internment camp, behind barbed wire, my interlocutor replied with a chuckle. On arrival in Budapest, we were transferred from the wagon to lorries and brought to a building that looked remarkably like a heavily guarded prison. It was a fortress perched on Mount Gellert 14, overlooking the city and the Danube. The lorries drove into the inner courtyard. The gates were closed. Shivering from the cold, we jumped to the ground. "Well, congratulations. We're back in prison," said a voice. It was a prison. We were fingerprinted and taken for interrogation, which lasted several hours. Then we were divided into groups of 5. Stasik and I, and 3 others from our group, were placed in a cell where there were already 14 Polish refugees. We looked around, but saw no familiar faces. We introduced ourselves. We were primarily interested in the conditions of detention. "You will soon find out for yourself," said one of the cell's inhabitants. "We live in luxury. Twice a day we are brought food, and twice a day we are allowed to go for a walk in the prison yard. There we can exchange news. From here you have a beautiful view of Budapest through the bars," another cellmate said. "At night, when you look at the city lit up with lights, you realize how right the poet was when he called Budapest the pearl of the Danube." "What are the prospects of getting out of here?" one of us asked. "Oh, the very best," came a mocking voice. "Every fortnight a shipment of about 100 men from the internment camp arrives, and in the meantime we're feeding millions of lice and we're starving," added another. "Why do they keep us here? Why don't they let us go to France?" I asked. "International arrangements. They're afraid of the Germans. Then why the hell don't they at least create normal conditions for us?" Why indeed? None of the representatives of the Hungarian side explained to us their point of view on this problem. They simply did not have the possibility to accommodate thousands of hungry, frozen, exhausted Poles who almost daily ran across the border. What we suffered most of all was not the cold, monotonous food and living conditions, but lice. The straw was teeming with lice. We itched constantly. The harmful insects got under our clothes, establishing colonies in our armpits, chest hair, and head. They were a terrible torment. There was no escape from the lice. We killed them by the hundreds, but thousands of new bloodsuckers replaced them. The walls of the cell were red with blood. We crushed the nasty insects against them. We hardly slept at all. There was no sleep. Just when you try to sleep, these things start their endless feast on your bitten body. You kill the scoundrels, fall asleep, and a few minutes later you wake up cursing and everything starts all over again. We spent 4 days with Stasik in that cell. From conversations with fellow inmates and during walks, we concluded that there was only one way to get out of the fortress and not to get behind the barbed wire. We had to escape from prison and get to the Polish consulate in Petin 15 in order to obtain civil documents. It was possible to get out of prison only under the pretext of illness, to persuade the Hungarians to take him to the city and there to escape from the guards. But the Hungarians had already learnt by bitter experience, and they were not easily persuaded. However, Stasik had a great idea. He took a tube of shaving cream and squeezed some into his mouth. We started banging loudly on the door. When the guards entered the cell, we shouted "Doctors," pointing at Stasik lying on the floor, foaming at the mouth. The guards went out, closing the door, but returned a couple of minutes later with a man in a white coat. Lucky for us, it was only a brother of mercy. "No, doctors." Again, we all shouted at once. The nurse looked at Stashek, said something to the guards, and then they took Stashek under their arms. Now it was time for me to appear on stage. "Doctor," I said, pointing a finger at myself, and continued. "Hospital." I grabbed Stasik's arm, ostensibly to count his pulse, and shouted again. "Clinic, clinic." It worked. Stasik and I were put into a van. A guard sat next to the driver, and we drove to Budapest. Stasik was still foaming at the mouth. "Relax," I told him in Polish. "Now we must not miss an opportunity to escape from the guards." "I'm not pretending," he complained. "I've swallowed so much cream that I really can't stop. It's horrible." At the hospital, the guard left us in the waiting room and went after the doctor. Wasting no time, Stasik and I, using caution, made our way out of the hospital. The guard at the gate shouted something to us in Hungarian, making understandable gestures with his hand. "Go away from here." He probably thought that we were beggars who had entered the hospital unnoticed. Now we had to find our way to the Polish consulate without falling into the hands of the police. Knowledgeable people in the prison explained that it was not the ordinary police that we had to fear, but the gendarmerie. The gendarmes wear triangular hats with feathers on the brim. They have rifles with bayonets fixed, and they always patrol in pairs. We found ourselves in a strange city with no money, dirty, unshaven, and slovenly dressed. Besides, we itched incessantly. The consulate, as far as we knew, was in Pest, on the other side of the Danube, and we had to cross the bridge and find the right street. This took us several hours. We were cold and very hungry. I asked directions from people we met. Some looked at us with suspicion, some tried to help us, and one couple snorted and walked on without stopping. When we finally reached the consulate, we saw several hundred Poles who had come for the same reason. They wanted to obtain documents allowing them to register as civilians. Among these people, dressed in clean suits and coats, wearing hats and gloves, Stasik and I in our dirty and crumpled ski suits looked out of place, to say the least. We suffered all night in the consulate courtyard, but the next day we got our civil passports and railway tickets to Barch. In this small town near the Yugoslav-Hungarian border, we were to be housed as civilian refugees. About 50 people were placed in a railway carriage, and accompanied by one policeman who made sure that no one got off at the stations. We travelled across the snowy Hungarian plains to our final destination. Late in the afternoon, the train arrived in Barch. The railway station was crowded with locals who were paid small sums of money for taking in refugees. An elderly man seemed to like Stasik and me and pointed us out to the official in charge of the refugees. We followed the man silently through the snowy streets. We could only communicate with the Hungarian in sign language. The man didn't know a word of Polish, and we knew only one word of Hungarian: "Thank you." He didn't seem to believe that we didn't have any luggage. but by waving empty hands, we seemed to convince him that we had come light. In addition to our clothes, we had a wristwatch and 2 gold rings that Antek had given me. When we entered the house, we were blinded by the bright light. When our eyes adjusted a little, we saw 4 people looking at us with undisguised curiosity. An old woman, apparently the owner's wife, 2 young women, and a young man about our age. We smiled, and they smiled back. For a quarter of an hour we exchanged smiles and gestures until the landlord intervened. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? He asked. We were stunned with surprise. Joe J. No etwa 17, I hesitantly answered. Ah, das ist got 18, he answered and quickly spoke in German, introducing us to his family. This is my wife. This is my married daughter who lives a few houses away from us. This is my youngest daughter, Marischka, and this young man is Marischka's fiancé. After everyone had introduced themselves, Stasik asked the host, "Where did you learn to speak German so well?" "It's because I'm German." "When?" "Who?" "German," repeated the man. "I came to Hungary as a child with my father. I stayed here, got married. That's how—" I probably said it with such obvious relief that the whole family, except for the groom, who didn't understand German, laughed. "Don't worry," said Marischka, laughing. "Even though we are half German, it doesn't mean that we have anything to do with the war." The mother began to set the table, and the eldest daughter and Marischka's fiancé said goodbye and went home. Stashek and I were invited to the table. "We have already had dinner," the hostess explained to us, "and you must be hungry." The trouble happened during dinner. Marischka and her parents were watching us eat, exchanging short phrases. Suddenly Marischka shrieked and pointed at my sleeve, saying something in Hungarian. Following her gaze, I saw a company of lice descending down my sleeve. With horror and disgust, the owners were watching the insolent insects, who had decided to come out into the open. Stashek and I stopped eating. After a short pause, the owners exchanged a few remarks, and there was silence again. "We're full of lice," I confessed. "We picked them up in prison in Budapest." After talking to the family, the head of the household said, "We can't leave you here." "I'm sorry. We should have warned you right away," Stasik said guiltily. "We'd better get back to the station," I said. We got up from the table without finishing dinner, and the old man began to put on his coat. Marischka retreated to a far corner. She and her mother stared at my sleeve. Having said goodbye, we followed our host out of the house. We had almost reached the station when Marischka caught up with us. Talking to her father about something, she said, "Please, let's go back." When we returned, the landlady had already melted the cooker. In spite of the cold, we stripped naked under the awning in the courtyard. We wrapped ourselves in some old rags, shivering from the cold, and waited for the water to warm up. There was no bathtub in the house. For washing, we used a large tin tub in the kitchen. Stasik was the first to wash, and I was left shivering under the awning. When my turn came, the master gave me soda and soap and left me alone. On the cooker in a large pot our clothes were boiling. I plunged into the hot water with pleasure. When I had washed myself, I wiped myself dry with a towel, walked to the room where Stasik was already fast asleep, and collapsed on the bed. I instantly fell asleep in a clean bed. I had not dreamed of such luxury for a long time, and after a hot bath. I had nightmares during the night. I was hot, so I threw off the blanket. A few hours later I woke up, because I was freezing to the bone. I had a terrible chill. Stasik was sound asleep. I reached for the blanket, but felt dizzy. The room seemed to do somersaults, and I lost consciousness. I didn't regain consciousness until the afternoon. There were people around, among whom I saw an agitated Stasik. Someone was laying hot bricks on me, someone was counting my pulse and listening to my breathing. My eyes went round, and the room spun again. They tried to talk to me, but I was unable to respond. When I regained consciousness, I saw Marischka sitting on a chair and Stashik leaning on the bed. They didn't immediately notice that I had regained consciousness. "How are you feeling, Stefan?" Stasek asked, seeing that I was looking at him. I tried to answer, but I couldn't. My tongue was stuck to my throat. Stasik gave me some water, and that helped. "What's wrong with me, Stasik?" "It was either flu or pneumonia." "I thought I was dying," I answered. "You're not dying. The doctor said you'll recover. They saved your life." Who are they?" These people. What happened? Hey, they saw you walking around the house naked. They realized you had a fever. You were delirious. They put you to bed. They put hot bricks on you. Marischka watched us, but of course she didn't understand. Will you thank them for me, Stasik? I asked, and feeling weak, I closed my eyes and fell asleep. I stayed in bed for several days, and the owners of the house surrounded me with attention and care. Stasik brought news of other Poles living in the town and informed me of their plans to go to France. In the evenings, Mariska came to see me, sometimes alone, sometimes with her fiancé Janusz. Mariska was a lovely girl, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, with a slightly upturned nose and bright red lips, untouched by lipstick. When she smiled, she had dimples on her cheeks that added to her charm. She had a graceful figure, and her movements were characterized by an extraordinary grace. I watched with pleasure as she moved around the room easily, as if dancing. Marischka had a habit of suddenly looking back to catch my admiring gaze. Her proximity made me dizzy. I could hardly restrain myself when she adjusted the blanket or fluffed the pillow to make it more comfortable for me to lie down. But one day I couldn't take it anymore. When she leaned over me, I wrapped my arms around her waist and kissed her. She grabbed my hair with one hand and raised the other, clearly intending to slap me, but changed her mind at the last moment. She took a glass of water from the table by the bed, splashed it in my face, and left the room looking like a princess offended in the best feelings. For the next 3 days she came to see me only accompanied by Janusz. I didn't like Janusz. I hated him for the fact that, as a fiancé, he put his arm round Mariska's shoulders. Even the way he spoke to Mariska annoyed me, even though I didn't understand a word. He also seemed to be annoyed when Mariska and I spoke German. He was clearly unhappy with Stasik and me, and he didn't even try to hide it. Thanks to the good care, I recovered quickly and was back on my feet in less than a week. As civilian refugees, we had the right to move freely around the city centre, but no further. Nearby was the border with Yugoslavia, which ran along the wide and deep Drava River, Stasik, and I received pocket money from the Hungarian authorities. It was only enough for soap and toothpaste. There was no industry in the city and therefore no way for us to earn any money. It was winter, and the farmers didn't need our services either. So it is not strange that the Poles in Barka, there were about 100 Poles living there, quartered in private houses, spent most of their time planning their escape to Yugoslavia, and from there to Italy and France. In the house next to ours lived 3 students from Warsaw who, like Stasik and me, were eager to get to France. Joining forces, we drew up a plan to escape to Yugoslavia. We needed a boat to cross the Drava, but several boats had already disappeared in Barka, stolen by Poles crossing to Yugoslavia, and the owners were now locking the boats. Once one impatient Pole, frustrated by the lack of boats, stole a large trough and tried to cross the Drava under cover of night. The trough overturned and the fugitive drowned. When the body was pulled out of the river, a funeral was organized, attended by all the Poles living in Barka. The bridge over the Drava connected Hungary and Yugoslavia. But it was, of course, guarded round the clock on both sides. It was rumoured that a few Poles managed to swim across the Drava under the bridge. But as soon as they reached the Yugoslav side, they were immediately sent back to Hungary, where the gendarmerie gave them the usual punishment. They were imprisoned for a fortnight. Later, 2 more Poles tried to swim across the Drava, but one of them drowned, and we went to the funeral again. However, the other one was luckier and managed to get to the other side. In gratitude for our hospitality, Staszek and I sawed and chopped so much firewood that we filled all the barns and sheds. We shoveled snow, sprinkled sawdust on the paths, repaired the fence, the radio, the owner's bicycle, and the owner's sewing machine. We even cleaned the chimney, and I used the soot for the snowman we made in the garden. During the day we helped with the chores, and in the evenings I looked forward to Marischka's arrival. She worked as a receptionist at the doctor's office. After dinner, I would sit in the living room and enjoy the company of my host's charming daughter. We were rarely alone together. As a rule, one of her parents or Janusz always sat in the living room. But at the rare moments when I could be alone with Mariska, I would try to express my admiration and feelings for her in my broken German, and with the help of some Hungarian words. Usually she laughed in response, shaking her charming head. But one day she suddenly reacted to my "Well, I wonder how many girls you have already said those words to, Istvan?" she asked, twisting my name into Hungarian. "Hey, I have never experienced anything like this, and I have never met a more charming girl than you. Really, Mariska. And if you meet an even prettier girl in Yugoslavia, or in France, or anywhere else you decide to go, you will say the same words to her and you will forget me. Isn't that right, Isvan? I am sure that there can't be another girl like that, I said, at that moment sincerely believing in what I had. Mariska was silent for a moment and then, putting aside her knitting, asked, I know that you want to escape to Yugoslavia, and from there even further, and you need a boat. But what's the hurry? Why do you want to leave? Are you unhappy here? It was difficult for me to explain to her in broken German why we had fled abroad from our country, devastated by the Germans and Russians. She hadn't seen people dying, hadn't been bombed. She had not seen unarmed people shot before her eyes. She had not seen orphaned children. She could not understand my feelings, my passion for revenge at all costs. She was only 20 years old. She had lived a peaceful life and had no idea what war was. But why are you in such a hurry to leave Hungary and us? Mariska repeated. The war will be over in a year, maybe even sooner, and you can go back to Poland. I can't stay here when others are risking their heads. Have you thought about what will happen to me, poor thing? She asked mockingly. Abandon me, and I decided that you really love me, Istvan. I laughed with pleasure. At last the conversation was going in the direction I wanted it to go. Maybe something will make me stay. What? A kiss, for starters, and then another kiss. And where will it lead? To a bed, I hope. I realized that I had crossed the line, but it was too late. Mariska abruptly threw the knitting on the table and silently left the room. I went to my room. Stazik was asleep and talking in his sleep. The next morning Stazik woke up in a great mood. He woke me up and told me that they had found the boat. No, 400 meters from the river, he said. How did you find it? Very simple. Janus helped. Can you imagine? Really, Janus? I asked incredulously. Yes. Last night he led us to the sawmill and then across the meadow to the river. Very nice of him, don't you think? And what kind of boat is that? That seemed some sort of flatboat. It's chained to a tree, but we can break the chain. Let's leave tomorrow. Take your time, Stazik. I want to see the boat first. Today you'll see it, and tomorrow morning we'll try it out on the river, okay? Januzzi says we shouldn't delay, or someone else will steal it. In the evening I made up some reason not to go to see the boat. I wanted to talk to Mariska, but she was always with Januz. I had no choice but to leave them. I walked along the empty snow-covered street. The light from the windows reflected on the snow crunching under my feet. Now I was probably ready to inspect the boat, but I didn't know where it was. Returning to the house, I saw that there was no light in the drawing room. Januzzi had gone out. Standing in the doorway was Mariska. She moved aside to let me pass, but I caught the clasp of my jacket on her dress. In the darkness we tried to unclasp. Our hands met. Her hair touched my face. Then I put my arms around her and we kissed. With her arms around my neck, Mariska responded passionately to my kisses. Suddenly she pushed me away and rushed into her room. I listened. It was quiet. Everyone in the house was asleep. What if they weren't asleep? I'd go to her room and be caught in the act. The remnants of common sense made me keep my head up. I went to my room, undressed in the dark and crawled under the covers, but sleep wouldn't come. It had snowed a lot during the night, and after breakfast Stazik and I were busy clearing the area. He kept saying something, but I was so absorbed in my own thoughts that I couldn't hear anything. He noticed that I wasn't paying attention to him, and when I once again didn't answer his question, he said, She's very pretty. I'm not blind. I can see that. But Stefan, this is not the time for love affairs. We must sail in a few days. Of course, I remember. In a few days, I repeated. I don't hear much enthusiasm in your voice. I don't feel any enthusiasm. Stazik muttered something to himself, then said angrily, Listen, Stefan. We have travelled a long way together, and I would like us to get to France together. If you're not going to move within the next few days, I'll leave without you. We went back to the house and helped rearrange the furniture. Christmas was approaching and the owners were going to have guests. We were still moving furniture when some students we knew came in and told us that they had found the 6th member of the crew, and now we could sail to Yugoslavia. Stefan, you are the only one of us who knows how to handle the boat. You must examine it, Stasik insisted. I didn't want to run away, but I agreed to see the boat. After convincing the owner to stock up on sawdust for the paths, we took the sacks and went to the sawmill. Next to the shed was a flat-bottomed boat made of unplanked planks. It looked decent from afar, but for fear of attracting attention, I couldn't examine it up close. Well, what do you think? Stasik asked. It looks all right, I answered, but if 6 people sit in it, it will settle too much. No. So what? No. So what? She'll be overtaken by the first wave. So what do we do? Nothing. Are you ready to sail if she capsizes? Don't play captain, Stefan. Explain to me what the boat is supposed to do. To take us to the other side, I think. Is this boat good for that? I think so. Good. Then that's what we'll use. We looked around and realized that there was no place to sleep at the sawmill, which meant that no one would be here at night. It really wasn't more than 400 meters to the river. Well, everything was clear, and having filled the sacks with sawdust, we followed the owner home. The way back passed in silence, and only on the approach to the house the old man remarked, "Be careful, the boat may leak," and, sighing, asks, "Are you going to sail before Christmas?" "No, we plan to set sail on the second Christmas night," Stasek replied. "The Yugoslav border guards will be celebrating Christmas, and we will slip unnoticed onto their shore." I was very surprised, but I didn't let it show. That's a good idea," said the old man, and he didn't say another word until he got home. That evening Marischka did not dine with us. Concerned about her absence, I asked if something was... "Tonight she is having dinner with her fiancé," my mother explained. "He was leaving in the morning to celebrate Christmas with his parents in Peaks." I tried to hide the fact that I was pleased with the news. After dinner, I wrote letters to my relatives in Poland, informing them that I had arrived safely in Hungary. After the war, I learnt that they had not received my letters. I saw Stasik leave, and then I fell asleep sitting at the table, probably because of the sleepless night. The landlord woke me up before I went to bed, and I went to our room. Stasik was already fast asleep. The master had switched off the light and retired to his bedroom, which was next to his daughter's bedroom. After a while, I heard Marischka's footsteps outside and rushed downstairs to meet the girl at the door of the house. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She had snow in her hair, her cheeks cold from the frost, but her lips were warm. When I started kissing her, I thought that a few minutes ago she must have been kissing Janus, but immediately dismissed the thought. Now I was hugging and kissing her. I started to whisper soft words to her, but she put her finger to my lips, silencing me. Taking my hand, she walked into the living room. We sat down on the couch and started kissing, gently at first and then with more and more passion. Out of fear that my parents might wake up and come into the living room unexpectedly, we hugged and kissed without saying a word. The next 2 nights I came to Marischka, and a few hours of love passed imperceptibly in frenzied caresses, and then she threw me out of the room. Christmas came. On the 25th of December, after a festive dinner, we all went to Marischka's married sister who lived next door, where the fun was already in full swing. We also took part in dancing, singing, drinking Tokay. Marischka laughed, danced, and we kissed for a moment when no one, as we thought, saw us. When I was about to leave, it turned out that Marischka was staying here. My sister and her husband were going to his parents for 3 days, and Marischka was staying at their house to feed the cat and the dog. "I'll be back in an hour," I whispered to Marischka. "No, Istvan, don't come, don't." "I'll be back." We went home with her parents. The drunken wine put the old man in a good mood. He sang at home, and I even tried to echo him. After saying good night to our hosts, Stashek and I went to my room. He undressed immediately and went to bed. I waited until everyone was asleep, tiptoed downstairs, quietly opened the door and went out into the frosty night. Stasik saw me leave the room but said nothing. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. A song came from somewhere far away. A dog barked. I walked past unlit courtyards, approaching the cherished house. I jumped over the fence and went to the back door, but it was locked. I went round the house, but here too, the door was locked. So I went back to the back door again and knocked softly. The door opened, but Marischka wouldn't let me in. "You shouldn't have come, Istvan. They might see you. There's no one here. Everyone's asleep and I'm cold. Touch it." I took her hands in mine. They were I stepped into the house and closed the door behind me. Go away, Istvan. You must go. In the darkness I embraced her, warm and shivering beneath the light dressing gown. She did not push me away when I began to kiss her, and she responded to the kisses, mumbling incomprehensible Hungarian and German words and repeating my name between kisses. I greedily kissed her face, her lips, her hair. Taking Mariska in my arms, I carried her, bumping into furniture in the darkness, through the living room to the bedroom and lowered her onto the bed. She no longer resisted, and the world ceased to exist for us. The night was ours. After a few hours I realized it was time to come down to the sinful earth. Mariska, running her fingers through my hair, whispered something softly in Hungarian, in the dim pre-morning light penetrating through the frost-painted windows. I admired her delicate face framed by blonde hair that ran in light waves over her bare shoulders. What did you say, Mariska? Nichebe dich 19 Istvan. Say it again, but in Hungarian. Niseritlek Istvan. Miseritek Mariska, I repeated slowly. And now you say it in Polish, he asked. Jejci koszem, Mariska. J ishe koam. Stefan, she repeated and laughed, and once again, forgetting everything in the world, we clasped each other in a tight embrace. The morning dawn was dawning. It was time for me to go home. Mariska watched me dressing in silence. Do you have to go, Istvan? Without getting out of bed, she asked. Yes, I have to go. I can't let them see me coming back. That's not what I meant. You're going to sail across to Yugoslavia, aren't you, Istvan? I'll come back, Mariska. I'll definitely come back. But I have to leave. It's already decided. We'll sail at midnight when everyone's asleep. When will you be back? A year at the most. The war won't last much longer, and I'll be back in a year, if not sooner. A year, she repeated, but you could be killed. You might drown. No, Mariska, I interrupted. Nothing will happen to me. I'll definitely come back. Parting, we agreed to meet in the evening. I sneaked into the house, reached my room safely, and fell asleep as soon as my head touched the pillow. In the afternoon, Stasik and I met up with some students from Warsaw who lived next door, and another Pole who was the sixth person in our company. He had once served in the police force in Warsaw. This physically fit, stocky man was considerably older than us. The students took out a map of Yugoslavia, and we carefully studied the future route. We had to go at least 16 kilometers into the country before we could fall into the hands of the police. If fugitives were caught within 16 kilometers of the border, they were always sent back to the country from which they had escaped. In our case, it meant a 2-week stay in a Hungarian prison. We had no problems with our belongings. Toothbrushes and razors we could scatter in our pockets. After midnight, using extreme caution, we were to all gather at the sawmill, unhitch the boat, carry it across the field to the river, launch it, and swim to the other side. We really hoped we would be lucky and everything would go smoothly. I was involved in the plan, but mentally I was somewhere else. I was dreaming about Mariska, remembering the night I spent with her, her kisses, the warmth of her body, her gentle hands, her silky hair, the passion with which she responded to my caresses. Wake up, Stefan. A harsh voice interrupted my reverie. I thought you were going to be captain of our boat. How are we doing on oars? Shit, we don't have any oars. We should get some planks from the sawmill. By the way, does everybody know how to row? I can't. Neither can I. But somebody's got to help me. The current could be very strong, and it would be difficult for me to steer the boat alone, I explained. All right, then I'll be the assistant captain, Stasik volunteered. You just tell me what to do and I'll follow your orders. We agreed to meet at our house at 11 o'clock in the evening and parted. Stasik took the field binoculars from his master and went closer to the shore. He wanted to see at what intervals the Hungarian border patrols appeared on the shore. When Mariska returned from work and we all sat down to dinner, the conversation revolved mainly around our night expedition. The owners of the house did not understand why we had decided to leave Hungary in such a hurry, and it was difficult for us to explain in a few words the reason for such haste. What was it that moved us? A patriotism, or a kind of excitement to be in France as soon as possible, or both combined? Or perhaps each of us had a different reason. We were all anxious to leave, and nothing could keep us away. I was the only exception. Mariska. After dinner, I didn't manage to be alone with her. When I saw that she was about to leave the room, I tried to sneak out, but her father decided to show me the family album and I had to stay. When our 4 companions arrived at the appointed time with bottles of Tokar to drink a farewell drink with the hospitable owners of the house, Marischka returned to the living room and joined us. Midnight was approaching. The Tokarskoi had been drunk, and it was time to part. My companions, joyously excited, sang Polish songs. The old man hugged each of us, and his wife slipped us sandwiches for the road and wished us good luck. If the river is too wide, come back. Remember, you're always welcome here. One of us thanked our hosts in broken German for their hospitality. The old man said a word in return, and his wife even cried. All this time Marischka and I looked at each other without taking our eyes off each other. We could not give vent to our feelings in full view of everyone, and only exchanged glances. We left the house. Marischka and her parents waved at us for a long time. I went last, and in my head was beating one thought. I'm leaving Marischka, I'm leaving Marischka, I'm leaving Marischka. But we had no luck. The Yugoslav border guards were waiting for us on the other side and immediately sent us back. At our knock, the door was opened by an old man. He made coffee while we told him what had happened to us. Then our 4 companions went home, and Stasik and I went up to our room. Why do you think the Yugoslavs were waiting for us? Did we make too much noise? Stasik asked me, undressing and getting into bed. It's hard to say. Why don't you go to bed, Stefan? I won't sleep anyway. I'd better go for a walk. Hey. I waited for about an hour until everyone finally settled down. Then I slipped quietly out of the room and hurried to Marischka's. I was just about to knock, and she already opened the door. We were deployed from Yugoslavia. I began to explain, but she wouldn't even listen. Wrapping her delicate arms around my neck, she kissed me to silence me. Marischka held me so tightly, as if I was going to immediately run abroad again. She did not want to let me go even in the morning, when I had dressed to go to my room, for fear that everyone in the house would soon wake up. She let me go only when the first footsteps of passers-by came from the street. I was already standing in the doorway when the girl called out to me. What, Marischka? Istvan, IAA, Marischka whispered, sitting on the bed hugging her pillow. It's my fault that the Yugoslav border guards brought you back. I warned them over the phone. I was stunned with amazement. I wanted to see you again, Stefan. Don't be angry. I'm not angry, my happiness. I'm not angry at all. I'm just surprised, that's all. I hugged her and kissed her. I was so reluctant to leave her, but it wasn't worth the risk. When we met, I did not tell my comrades of Marischka's treachery, especially as they did not seem to be distressed by our failure, and were anxious to try again as soon as possible. During the night, it became very cold. I came to Marischka again, and we, lost in passion, forgot everything. In the afternoon, we heard that the river was frozen with ice. The whole company decided to cross the ice to Yugoslavia the next night. I was categorically against it. One cold night doesn't solve anything. The frost has to stay for a few days. Have you forgotten what the current is like there? I tried to persuade my impatient companions. In the evening, Janos came. He completely ignored my presence, and later I heard him arguing with Marischka about something. They spoke Hungarian, of course, and I understood nothing of their conversation. Finally, Janus left. I also spent that night with Marischka and came home in the morning. It was our last night in someone else's house. Mariziska's sister and her husband were coming back in the afternoon. I spent the day, as always, impatiently waiting for the next night, remembering the past one. In the evening, Starshik broke through. Stefan, the ice is strong enough to hold us. We're leaving tonight. I've already warned everyone. Was it really that cold last night? I wondered. Like in Siberia, Stefan. Like in Siberia, Stasik replied, and added snidely. But you couldn't have known that, because you were warm. Yes, I was warm, but that's my own business. Of course, who would mind? You can stay here until your parents find out and kick you out of the house. And we're going across the ice to the other side tonight, he said firmly. Are you coming with us, or are you going to wage war in bed? Go to hell, I yelled. He shrugged and left the room. At dinner, Stasik announced that he was leaving for Yugoslavia tonight. Are you going alone? The old man asked. No, we're leaving together, I answered, trying not to look at Marischka. This time we didn't organize a send-off. At about 11 o'clock in the evening we met at our house, said goodbye to our hosts and went to the river. I took a moment to slip the letter to Marischka and clasp her hand in farewell. We went to the same place where we had launched the boat. In the bushes, covered with snow, lay our boat, but there was no need for it now. Staszek and I took a plank each, which we used as oars. We waited in the bushes for the Hungarian border patrol to pass by, piled ourselves in snow for camouflage and approached the river. In the moonlight, the river, shrouded in ice, shone silver. The snow was falling quietly. I stepped carefully onto the ice. I heard a light crackling sound. I took a few more steps. The ice didn't fall through. How was it? I heard a whisper from the shore. Can we go? Wait, I'll go further away. I took a few more steps and I found myself in the water. The only thing that kept me from being dragged under the ice was the board I was holding. I held onto the board that blocked the hole. The water was icy. I was afraid to make an unnecessary movement, but I felt my legs, deprived of support, being pulled by the current. Those who remained on the shore were very frightened. Staszek tried to reach out his board for me to grasp, but it was too short. Then he crawled towards me on the ice, but the ice cracked and he had to return to the shore. The hole was getting bigger and bigger. I could feel my arms getting weaker. At any moment I could be pulled under the ice, and then I saw Staszek crawling towards me on a board. He was held by one of the students by the legs, who in turn was held by the second and the third. The chain was completed by the sixth member of our team, a former policeman whom the students had found. With his feet firmly planted on the ground, he closed the chain, holding the legs of the third student. Finally, Staszek crawled up, grabbed me by the shoulders and commanded pull. Slowly, step by step, breaking the ice in front of me, they pulled me to the shore. Come on, come on. We must get him home, someone shouted, and I felt myself being carried back to the house we'd left only an hour before. Our arrival woke up the whole family. While the old man melted the cooker, the others took off my wet clothes. Soon I was in bed, given some hot drink, and, as had been the case in the recent past, covered with hot bricks. Late at night, realizing that the danger was over, and that I was coming to my senses, the old men and Marischka went to bed. From behind her mother's back, Marischka sent me a kiss. After they left, Staszek undressed and got into bed, but before turning off the light, he turned to me. I'm sorry, Stefan. It's my fault. I got you into this adventure. But you got me out, too. You know, I was terrified. Death by ice, brr. It was my impatience, Staszek continued. I wanted to leave as soon as possible. Besides, we were told that the ice is very hard. Who told you that? Janews. He said he went out on the ice himself. Yeah. You think so? I don't know. It's very possible. In the morning, I woke up completely healthy. I didn't even have a runny nose. In the afternoon, we met the whole team and decided to make another attempt when the ice was strong enough. The frost was getting stronger, and we hoped that we wouldn't have to wait too long. In the evening, Janusz did not come to visit Marischka as usual. After dinner, when she was about to go to her room, I managed to be alone with her. I told her that during the day I had made a reconnaissance and found out that I could get into her room through the window, as long as she left it open. She agreed, but it seemed to be a difficult decision. She was obviously very afraid of her parents. At midnight, when everyone in the house was already asleep, I went out the back door, walked through the snowdrifts along the house and knocked on Marischka's window. The window opened, I climbed in and closed it behind me. Marischka, against her custom, did not rush into my arms. She froze at the door and listened sensitively to the silence. But everything was quiet. We went to bed, and soon in passionate kisses and embraces we forgot, not only about our parents sleeping in the next room, but also about everything in the world. At some point we fell asleep, and when I woke up it was already light outside. I quickly got dressed and climbed out the window. As I opened the back door, I came face to face with the old man. He froze with surprise and was just about to wish me good morning when he noticed that I was wearing only my trousers and shirt, and my shoes were not laced. Without a word, he went outside and saw the footprints in the snow that led him to Marischka's window. I remained standing where I was. When the old man returned, his face was as white as the snow that had fallen during the night. Out, 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 he shouted. Out of my house. Now. I went up to our room and woke Staszek. What's the matter? He asked, yawning. We must leave this house immediately. Why? What happened? What's the rush? Marischka, the old man. He kicked us out of the house. What did you expect? His blessing? Scolding me in all sorts of ways. Starzek got out of bed and got dressed. As we walked towards the exit, we saw the old man sitting in the kitchen. With his head resting on his hands on the table, he didn't even move as we passed by. As I closed the front door, sobs came from the kitchen.